Today we are going to be comparing historical perspectives into the idea of African colonialism. And particularly, we're going to look at two authors, one, A. Audubon, and another, Basil Davidson. And what they'll provide are two different perspectives to what was the idea of the colonialism of the African states. Bowen provides arguments that factor into the idea of what was the African state and who were the African people that became influenced by the European colonial system. He sets forth four areas that were of equal balance in these colonial states led by these European powers. And what he argues is that the response of the African people was nearly immediate. When you look at the idea of peace and order, mass production, infrastructure, health, and education, these were the four things that the European powers, as colonial leaders, came in to provide either directly or indirectly. And what Bowen argues is that the exploitation of the human materials and the idea of the material resources in each of these states, when there was a lack of balance, which there was immediate imbalance in every single one of those states, there was a fight right away. And that there were rebellions and various different ways that people in these states stood up to say, no, this is not the way we like it. We don't like the way that you're coming in here and doing this. We had a way that was working. And so basically arguing that the idea of independence and a fight against colonial rule wasn't something that happened as a result of the weakening of these European states in World War II, but that actually that fighting started long ago. How long ago? Well, actually, in the late 19th century up through World War I, there was resistance throughout Africa. Local revolts were usually put down through taxation or tyrannical control, but through migration, the creation of maroon communities, and then even resistance from urban and educated elite through reforms, involvement in the local councils and governments, and then even from Christian churches. There was resistance always. These were not people who just sat by and watched all this happen. The resistance was small, it was localized, and it would grow as the years went by. Now, one of the very unique perspectives about Bowen and what he argues was a real significant transition towards the movements for independence throughout Africa was the fascist occupation of Ethiopia. When Mussolini and the Italians took over what was considered a free state in Africa and really had no connections or ties to any European colonial state, it really intensified the desire of other nations to actually start fighting against this European colonial rule. Now, there were strategies that became much more sophisticated as a result of this takeover. More people were very much impacted by that colonial control when there was this actual military conquest of that nation. But he also talks about how after World War II, and particularly pointing out this occupation, that there were many conscripted soldiers that returned, and actually there were many conscripted soldiers that took part in the liberation of Ethiopia from the fascists on the side of the Allied forces. And they saw this freeing of the state and returned to their homes to say, well, why are we fighting for you to be these places independent, and then now we come back and we're not independent? So it's a very unique argument about how that vested interest in creating that independence led to a widespread focus of fighting for independence throughout Africa. Another key respect that we need to pay attention to, and one thing that Davidson speaks strongly to, is the idea of the Great Depression. And then also, as we've heard before, the spreading of Pan-Africanism. Once some of those voices of democracy like W.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, who had very strong ties to Jamaica as a Jamaican and then also into Africa, when those voices started to spread throughout Africa, that also created a core idea of leadership and a push to want to bring these ideas of democracy and independence throughout the African states. So to summarize some of the arguments of Bowen, here are his 5 examples of the factors that led to the fall of colonialism throughout Africa. We've discussed a couple of these, this idea of the Italian occupation being a very unique argument of his. The idea of Pan-Africanism in World War II is a very common belief of how it did play a significant role eventually in decreasing that colonial involvement in these nations directly. But a big part, what I think is significant is 4 and 5, is the impact that all of these factors led into creating a strong leadership. And we see people like Ahmed Ben Bella in Algeria, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, as well as Gamal Nasser in Egypt, people who rose to power to bring a democratic idea in their country, but also really the idea of creating a constitutional movement, which they sometimes did legally, and then other times they did maybe not so legally or very unconstitutionally, but it was the idea of creating a movement where they would create their own independent state. So now that brings us to Basil Davidson's argument. And Basil Davidson provides a very Eurocentric belief into the idea of the impact on what caused a lot of the African independence movements. And he starts out right away with, which I mentioned, talking about some of the ideas that Bowen presented, is that the Great Depression greatly impacted the ability of the European colonial powers to maintain a strict control over a lot of the independent African states. And pretty much what he kind of gets at is this idea of how the Great Depression completely changed how much import and export could come in and out of other African colonial nations. These imperial powers, basically suffering at home, had to kind of reorganize the way that they would import, export things from these African states. And since they had created a system economically where the control was pretty much fully controlled by these trading nations, as a way to maintain some control over their ability to profit off of the resources that were there, they also forced these nations to only purchase goods from that state. So if it was England, France, Italy, the Netherlands, whoever it was, there were controls and tariffs and taxes that would definitely impact those nations financially. And what it did is it basically way increased the cost of things like, basic ideas of foodstuffs, basic products that they needed for survival. And because there were less and less jobs due to the decrease in the economy, companies that were importing, exporting things had to lay people off, and typically the people who did not benefit from this were the African people. And so this was a huge element to start to get a lot of the African people, especially those in the more urban controlled and central areas, to start working towards independence. And we'll see like an increase in ideas of the urban elites starting to organize workers to see more union and wage striking, and then work decreases, and people doing things to really start fighting for those workers' rights, and then also those economic rights as well.
And what these economic rights boil down to were the fact that Africans were going to be mistreated when the Depression happened, because the imperial nations still needed money to pay off debt and for their own education and health services, so they looked to the colonies by increasing taxes and tariffs and quotas so that competition would decrease. And then they increased taxes on the Africans, but not the non-Africans. And this inequality really just became heightened as we entered eventually into World War II, which would be the tipping point.
So Davidson also mentions the idea of this fascist takeover of Ethiopia. He doesn't necessarily call it out as a turning point in the movement against colonial rule by the African people, but he definitely marks it as kind of a significant event in African history, as a way to say this was kind of the last straw. As colonialism, really, which was around for less than 100 years in Africa, this nation, which basically fought for their own independence, the fact that this new European power was coming in for this like imperial piece of the cake that they normally hadn't, and they initially hadn't, and they represented kind of this fascist regime. And when many of these African, East and West African soldiers joined the war effort to help fight for this freedom and this independence, it really signified an almost symbolic change in that idea of colonialism. The African people recognized it as you're going to ask us to fight for this freedom against Germany and Japan and Italy, but then when we're done, you're not going to just give us our freedom. It created a real complex irony. And I think that, this is something that Davidson and Bowen very uniquely and very interestingly provide as a perspective to say this was something that really set the tone for all the future moves to modern politics in Africa. So after World War II, there's a transitioning of Africa into more of a modern political system. Now, it doesn't work perfectly in a lot of different states. There are a lot of different ways that these European powers have kind of manipulated the political and social divisions that had existed in Africa for years. But the inclusion of the United Nations plays a significant role, and Davidson points this out, in transitioning and helping the African states transition into modern political era. Now, if you read a little bit from what we read from Bowen in the beginning of the unit, you may have pointed out that or referenced the idea that prior to colonial or imperial involvement in Africa, many of the African states were really moving towards these ideas of kind of modern political alliances and kind of an ending of that tribal system. And that after the end of slavery, they were really just trying to reorganize their trade system and something that had existed for thousands of years. And so the real thing that I think is going to be very significant in the understanding of these independence movements and what these two historians really kind of, I think, come together to really recognize is the idea of it's a change to get of a system, of a worldwide system that happens after World War II. And the United States plays a significant role in kind of guiding through the UN to pressure states like Britain and France, who are weakened as a result of fighting in these two wars and the Great Depression, that they don't really have a same seat at the table as the United States does. Also included in this, of course, is going to be the Soviet Union, and that's a big part of what we talk about when we look at the Cold War. But as far as Africa is concerned, they are going to start transitioning into this period of becoming independent states. And how they do it is all very unique. It does have a little bit of a tie to how these colonial powers control them, but ultimately it's going to be a movement towards creating semi-democratic modern political states.
So this transition to modern politics was really a very complex thing. There are a lot of reasonings behind this. I think really the contradiction, you say we were tribes yesterday, today we are nations. You say nations are to be free. I think that defines the idea of African independence. It's basically calling out the fact that this movement from modern tribes to modern nations came as a result of really this growth of democracy that occurred. But there's a lot of other things too. I mean, we talked about the idea of Pan-Africanism, the movement from minority movements to more mass politics. But ultimately, the decline in the colonial system was obvious, and that was all economic. The food systems and population growth, it was not working. There were very, very little jobs. There was an increase in migrant labor, the expansion of urban centers, and I think the biggest thing is education. The people just didn't want to learn about a king and a queen anymore when they had defeated them.
And I think Davidson ends his argument with a very significant quote. I'd like you to take a second and read this quote. I think this is a very interesting statement, and it brings about some of the ideas of discourse, hope, communication, and the things that were going to be necessary for modern politics to form in Africa. I don't think personally as a historian that many of these ideas are available in any national democratic state. Typically, especially if you look at our current political system, all of these four things, we struggle with those. And a lot of times people will look at the idea of Africa and Africa as a democratic nation, that they're struggling to build these things in some respects. And many times it's argued that the European control over those states caused some of that division. The reality is that as human beings, we struggle with this everywhere all over the world. And it's interesting to note that in these historical perspectives, we found kind of a common theme, but they just kind of put it in a little different way. And that common theme was the idea that the people of Africa were looking for their independence, their control over their national sovereignty, well before World War II ever happened. So the idea that World War II caused African independence makes it like a Eurocentric ideal, that because of World War II and the Europeans fighting, the Africans gained their independence. The true argument, I think, if you took both of these perspectives, is that the idea of hope and communication and the belief in a discourse towards independence began way before World War II and way before Europeans ever actually came in to imperialize and control these African states. It just was a matter of time of making sure that that discourse came together and managed to create some sort of independent idea of nationhood. Thanks for listening, and I hope that our debate goes well.